My name is David Reed. I am the president of the Streatorland Historical Society. I'm also the president of the board of directors here at the Streator Public Library. We're doing a program tonight on the Poundstone Flag. And the reason we're doing the program on the flag tonight is because it's June 14th and it's Flag Day, and we thought it would be very appropriate that we do that. The reason June 14th is Flag Day is because on June 14th, 1777, Continental Congress decided to unify the flag, have one flag that all the Revolutionary War states were fighting under would be the same. And they chose the flag that George Washington was using outside of his commanding tent, which was what we know as the Betty Ross flag, or the Continental flag, the circle with the 13 stars. Up until June 14th, 1777, we were fighting under about 20 different flags. Each one of the colonies had their own flag. Several of the colonies had 2 or 3 flags. So they needed to codify it, and that's why June 14th is Flag Day. But I could go on for an hour about the United States flag, but I want to talk tonight about the Poundstone flag, because this has local history tied to it. Poundstone flag was made right here in Streator, Illinois. It was the flag of the 53rd Volunteer Regiment. So to tell you about the flag, I have to tell you about the 53rd. So we're going to go back to the beginning. November 1860, Lincoln gets elected. We all know that. We know it was very contentious. If you think the election of 2016 was contentious, nothing compared to 1860. It was so bad, 7 states seceded from the Union before his inauguration. 4 more joined him, so 11 states actually left the Union and made the Confederate States of America. It was in April 8th of 1861, right after Lincoln was inaugurated, that South Carolina bombarded Fort Sumter. That wasn't the real beginning of the war, though. I mean, that kind of solidified we were going into the Civil War. But the first battle didn't happen until July 21st, 1861. And that was the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, whichever one you want to call it. And up to that point, people in the North were saying, bring it on. You know, these ragtag farmers and these shopkeepers and these amateur soldiers in the South are never going to defeat the standing army of the United States of America. Come on in. They're never going to defeat the standing army of the United States of America. At the time, the United States Army was 16,000 strong, which in retrospect was a very small army. But that was the thought of the people in the North. It was going to be a one and done. One big battle, the Civil War would be over, the South was going to put its tail between its legs and go back south, and everything would go back to normal. Lincoln was a little more astute than the average citizen. Lincoln had said several times before his inauguration that if it came to an armed conflict, that every household in every state of the nation was going to be affected. It was going to be long, it was going to be drawn out, and it was going to be bloody. And, you know, in hindsight, you can see Lincoln was a lot more right than most people, because it was. So what happened at Bull Run surprised a lot of people. The South kicked the North's butt in the first major battle of the war. It happened right outside of Washington, D.C. It sent the Union Army retreating in chaos back into Washington, D.C. If they had followed up, might have been the end of the Civil War right then after the first battle, but they didn't. Well, Lincoln knew he needed volunteers. He knew he needed a lot of volunteers, so he called for all the states, a call to arms. He wanted 12,000 troops from each state of the Union. And he wanted them to get them to volunteer. Now, this was in July, August of 1861. It was not long after that 2 men from this area, John Cushman and Daniel Hitt, they both got together and decided they were going to raise a regiment of LaSalle County residents only. And now you have to consider a regiment in the Civil War was 1,000 men. It was made up of 10 companies of 100 men in each company. And that's how you got your 1,000 men. The population of the 1860 census was only 42,000 people in LaSalle County at the time. I mean, we were an agriculture, very unpopulated area. And to say you're going to get 1,000 young men to walk away from their jobs, walk away from their girlfriends, walk away from their families and their wives and their children to go fight for the Union was a bold thing to do. But Hitt and Cushman made that challenge, and they were going to sponsor this new regiment. So they went out and they had rallies all over LaSalle County. And they would have a rally in Marseilles. Then they'd have one in Tonopah, then one in Washington Square in Ottawa, then maybe one up in Seneca. So they moved all over, and they had a rally every 4 or 5 days. And the goal of each rally was to get 100 young men to sign up and try to make a company at each rally. Of course, they fell short of that goal, most of them, so they have to go back and have more rallies later. But when they did a rally, what they would do is they'd have an advance team go out and put posters all over town, like Tonopah. And in 1861, there was not a lot of entertainment. You didn't have Netflix and Google and anything like that. So when you saw a poster that there was going to be a big rally, recruiting rally for a Civil War regiment, everybody in that area went to the rally because they knew there was going to be bands playing and speeches made, and it was a big community event. And that's what they would do. They'd get the local politician, the mayor, they'd get some prominent businessmen to make speeches, they'd play patriotic music, and then they'd get a young man in a brand new uniform, and they'd get him up on stage, and they'd say, they'd talk about the gallantry and the glory of war, and this is what you can look like. And when it was time to sign up, they'd have a plant in the audience who would jump up and raise his hand, and he'd say, "I'm not a coward, I'll sign up." And he'd run up, and that put a lot of peer pressure on all the other young men in that small community. So those were the tactics they used, and they went from town to town, rally to rally. It took them until early December to get 800 men signed up. They had 8 full companies by December 1st, by December 1st. There was also a company that had already been organized in Marshall County, and a company had already been organized in Livingston County, south of Streator, that didn't have a regiment to be attached to. So the 8 companies that they had out of LaSalle County, plus the other 2, they had their 1,000 men signed up. They sent the paperwork down to Springfield, and they sent it to Governor Yates. He looked it over, everything was fine, and he approved the new regiment, and it was the 53rd Regiment of Illinois. The 53 only meant that it was the 53rd regiment to be approved. There's no other significance to the number other than it was the next number in line. So the new LaSalle County Regiment was the 53rd Illinois Regiment. They were told to be ready to be mustered into service at a moment's notice. The day after Christmas, 1861, they got their marching orders. They were told to go to Camp Douglas in Chicago as soon as possible. So the next day, which would have been the 27th of December, they met in Washington Square for a kickoff rally. They marched up to Joliet. At Joliet, they got on the trains, took them into Chicago, and they marched down to Camp Douglas. They were mustered into service at Camp Douglas on January 1st, 1862. That's easy to remember, New Year's Day, 1862, and they spent one of the harshest winters ever in this area at Camp Douglas. Now, Camp Douglas was a miserable place to be. It was on the south side of Chicago. It was on land that was owned by Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's rival in the 1860 election. They're all from Illinois, so I don't have to explain who Stephen Douglas is. But it was named after Stephen Douglas, who donated that land. The land was right on Lake Michigan, very much near where the Museum of Science and Industry is. So they were there all winter long. And what a miserable winter it was. You've all been by the lake in Chicago. You know how cold that breeze is. The barracks that they had to stay in were 12 feet wide, 24 feet long. And they were very hastily put together barracks, and these barracks only had one potbelly stove in each barracks. And that was their heat for all the men for the whole winter that were in those barracks. Now most Civil War regiments, when they went for training, they only got 2 or 3 weeks because they needed these regiments out on the field. And what happened to the poor 53rd, you know, they're up there and they're excited, right? They finally got there and they want to be soldiers and they've got visions of glory. So they get out and they, all day long, all they're doing is marching and drilling. They're drilling and marching and drilling day after day after day. They have to learn all that. The officers, Hitt and Cushman, are you know, learning how to be officers, or learning the commands, or learning the paperwork. The men are marching and drilling and drilling and marching. Just waiting for 2 to 3 weeks to be up and they can go down south. Well, Grant started winning a lot of battles down in Tennessee at this point. And something they did not call for, they didn't expect it to happen, Grant started sending up prisoners of war. And the North hadn't even thought about that yet. What are we going to do with these people? Well, we'll send them to Camp Douglas. So the orders of the 53rd Illinois got changed. Now they're going to stay there, and they are going to drill and march and march and drill. And when they're not doing that, they're going to babysit the prisoners of war. So that 2 to 3 week stay they were expected lasted till March 23rd. Virtually all winter, from January to March 23rd. March 23rd, they finally got their orders to join Grant in Tennessee. They got on the trains, they went down to St. Louis, they marched through southern Illinois, they marched through Tennessee, or through Kentucky into Tennessee, and it was on April 7th, 1862, at a little place called Pittsburgh's Landing, that they finally caught up with Grant. Now, besides these two gentlemen here, any other Civil War buffs in the room know what April 6th and April 7th, 1862 was? Shiloh. That's the Battle of Shiloh. They arrived too late in the day to get thrown into the battle, but they were there. And it's a good thing it was too late in the day, because the Battle of Shiloh, for those of you who don't know the significance, was up to that point the biggest, baddest, bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. Over 24,000 casualties, killed, missing, and wounded. Up until this part of the war, the casualties were always listed in the dozens or the hundreds, but to be listed in the thousands shocked the nation. It was that nasty of a battle, the Battle of Shiloh. And missing in action, you know, killed, wounded, or missing, most of my life, and I've been a Civil War buff all of my life, always considered missing as, oh, they were captured or they ran away. 95% of missing just meant there wasn't enough of the body to identify. You know, we've all seen videos on YouTube or whatever, somebody taking a high-powered rifle and shooting it into a watermelon that just explodes. Well, that was happening to a lot of the human body. So your cannons were shooting into men, and a dozen men would just disappear. You know, and just body parts would fly. I know it sounds a little graphic, but body parts would just fly everywhere. So missing a lot of times, most of the time, meant there just wasn't anything to identify. So, and that's what the 53rd arrived at when they got to Shiloh on April 7th. They got there later in the day. Grant had already turned the tide. He was already pushing the Confederates out of the area when they got there. But they were there for the cleanup and the aftermath of Shiloh. They were there for almost a week and a half, 2 weeks. They were on burial detail, which meant they were burying hundreds of bodies. They were getting buckets and wheelbarrows to pick up body parts and just burying them in graves. They were helping out in the hospital tents, where they wrote letters that they saw piles of amputated arms and legs waist high. These young men and boys from LaSalle County saw things young men and boys from LaSalle County shouldn't have had to see. But they were there, and they were in it. And I bet at this point, those young men that were 2 weeks earlier writing letters home complaining how tired they were of marching and drilling and drilling and marching, and they wanted to get into battle before the war was over, and they missed their opportunity to win some medals for their girlfriends. Now they're probably wishing they were back there instead of where they were, because they were with Grant. And Grant was a fighter. He was a bulldog. And for the next 13 months, from April of '62 from Shiloh till May of '63, when he arrived at Vicksburg, they fought constantly. The 53rd was at the Battle of Corinth, Grand Junction, LaGrange, Holly Springs, the Battle of Davis Bridge. They went down south of Vicksburg. They crossed the Mississippi. They were at the Battle of Raymond. They were at the first Battle of Jackson, Mississippi. This is all less than a year. They were at the first Battle of Jackson, Mississippi, which was significant because Jackson, Mississippi was located 40 miles due east of where Vicksburg is. And Vicksburg was his goal because Vicksburg sat up on a hill overlooking a sharp bend in the river. And they controlled the flow of boats up and down the river from there. So for us to get Mississippi River for supplies and men and ammunition, we needed to take out Vicksburg. So that was his goal. But before he went to Vicksburg, he went to Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, Mississippi still is, the state capital of Jackson. So when he went to Jackson and he took Jackson from Joe Johnston, General Joe Johnston, it was a big deal because the Union Army out east is losing every day. Grant's winning, winning, winning. And when he took Jackson, Mississippi, that was a deep South state capital. So it was a real morale booster for Abraham Lincoln and the Union and the people of the North, that something good was happening. Grant was the one doing it. The 53rd was with him every step of that way. Now, while he was at Jackson, Jackson was it was a hub of railroads, communication hub, it was a transportation hub. So while he was at Jackson, he tore up every railroad, burned down every bridge and trestle, tore down all the telegraph lines, because he wanted to cut it off. And once he wreaked havoc and he burned down the warehouses with all the bales of cotton and all the supplies that he couldn't use, he turned his attention to Vicksburg. He started marching 40 miles west into Vicksburg. As he was going, he was tearing up the railroad lines, burning bridges on the way. They fought at the Battle of Champion Hill, halfway between Vicksburg and Jackson. Champion Hill was another very mean, nasty battle that the 53rd was in. Of course, Grant won that battle. He finally arrives at Vicksburg after 13 months of fighting on May 19th, 1863. And he couldn't help himself. Grant had waited and worked so hard to get to Vicksburg. As soon as he got there, he told Sherman to take 20,000 men of his army and attack the fortifications of Vicksburg. He wrote in his memoirs later that it was the biggest mistake he made as a commander, because he didn't have his whole army up yet. Half of them were still on the roads for miles coming up. And he just had his lead element at Vicksburg, and he sent them into battle. Unprepared, without a plan, he just couldn't wait to attack Vicksburg. While the Confederate Army was well entrenched in the high grounds, behind all kinds of fortifications, with all kinds of ammunition, all kinds of reinforcement, and a lot of boys in blue died on May 19th, 1863, when he made that charge. He learned his lesson. He didn't attack again until 3 days later. He waited for his army to get up. He got them organized, got them all in place, and he made another frontal assault on Vicksburg. This time, same result. A lot of boys in blue died. He realized they're too well fortified, they're too well armed, they're too well reinforced to take by force. So he decided he was going to lay in a siege at Vicksburg. And that's what he did. He surrounded the city bombarded them day and night, sharpshooters shooting into the city. The 53rd was with them all 6 weeks of Vicksburg. Now we're going to leave them there, right there at Vicksburg. And I'm going to tell you a little about this guy up here. That's George Poundstone. George Poundstone was born in Fayette County, Pennsylvania in October of 1831. When he was 4 or 5 years old, at a very young age, his father, Richard Poundstone, moved his family by wagon train to LaSalle County. Richard's brother brought his family at the same time. His brother's name was Robert. Robert settled his family in Ottawa. Richard settled his family in Farm Ridge Township, which is right south of Ottawa, just north of Grand Ridge. Richard Poundstone started a farming and a cattle breeding operation. He was very, very successful. He got very rich. He had 3 boys and 2 daughters. All 3 boys stayed at home and worked the farm. They were all still living and working on the farm in 1861 when Hitt and Cushman were doing their drive to raise the regiment of the 53rd. On October 16th, George Poundstone's 30th birthday, he enlisted at a rally that was held in Washington Square, downtown Ottawa. His brother, Robert, which was named after his uncle, his brother Robert also enlisted. Robert enlisted in Ford's cavalry, and George Poundstone enlisted in the infantry. George must have been a very good soldier, because right from the beginning, as soon as they got to Camp Douglas, George was named the corporal of Company C. And the fact that he was in Company C tells us he was one of the first 300 to enlist, because the first 100 would be Company A, the second 100 Company B, and the third 100 would be Company C. So he was one of the early ones to enlist. He would have been one of the oldest, 30 years old when he enlisted. Most Civil War soldiers were only 18 to 22 years old. So maybe because he was older, he was made the corporal, had a little more respect. You could tell he was a very strong, sturdy guy, worked on a farm his whole life. But not only was he made the corporal of the company, but the members of the entire regiment vote on who gets to be in the color guard. And he was elected to be one of the 10 members of the color guard. Now, only the best of the soldiers get that honor. You got to be smart, you got to be brave, you got to be strong. The best and the brightest get to be in the color guard. Everybody wanted the honor of being in the color guard. He was selected to be one of the 10 in the color guard. So now he's not only one of only 10 corporals, with 1 corporal for each company. Out of 1,000 men, he's only one of the 10 corporals. Now he's only one of the 10 in the color guard. And the color guard gets together and they select the color sergeant. The color sergeant is the man who leads the color guard. They selected George Poundstone to be the color sergeant. So now he's got his duties as a soldier, he's got his added duties as a corporal, and now he's got added duties as the head of the color guard unit. Now, the reason there are 10 members of the color guard unit is because you have 2 flags. You have a national flag, and then you have a regimental flag. So you have 2 flag bearers. And because they're unarmed, they have to be guarded. So they have 4 guards for each color bearer. So that's why you have 10 in the color guard unit. Some regiments went with only 8. They would have 3 people guarding each flag. The 53rd had 10 members of the color guard unit. So it tells you a lot about George Poundstone. Like I said, you have to be brave, because when you're carrying this flag into battle, you are out front. You are in front of the regiment, the first in the line of battle. You have to be strong, because this flag is 6 feet by 6 feet. Well, this one's actually 6 feet by 6 feet 6 inches, but that's 36 square feet of silk that catches a lot of wind. The pike that it was on, the staff, was 9.5 feet tall. So you have to hold it up. And the reason you have the flag is to give guidance to the 1,000 men that are in the regiment. They don't know where they're going. They're only told from day one to rally around the flag. Wherever that flag goes, you go. It goes right, you go right. It goes left, you go left. It stops, you stop. Always know where your flag is. Which means he had to be smart and he had to be cool-headed. Because when you're carrying this flag into battle, the generals, when they organize their battle plan the afternoon or the day before a big battle, they can't tell 20, 30, 40,000 men what the plan is. They get the brigadier generals in. A brigade is usually 3 to 4 regiments put together makes a brigade. And each of them have their own general. They were part of Lauman's brigade. So he was their brigadier general. So they bring the brigadier generals in and they say, here's the battle plan, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and your little part of the battle plan is this. And then that brigadier general would go back and he would get his 3 colonels and his 3 color sergeants together. And he'd say, and this is just a hypothetical situation, he might say, okay, the plan is that clump of hills over there across the way is right to the right of that where we think the weak spot of the enemy is. So they're going to bombard with artillery that area for about half an hour. And when the guns go silent, our brigade is going to start marching toward that. The brigade that the 53rd was in, Lauman's brigade, consisted of the 53rd Illinois, the 3rd Ohio, and the 41st Indiana. So he might say, okay, I want Indiana lined up here, 100 wide, 10 deep. Next to them, Illinois, next to them, Indiana. When you get halfway across the field, I want Illinois and Indiana to stop. Ohio, keep going and change to 10 wide, 100 deep. So you're going into that area as a spear. As soon as you hear those guns, the artillery stop firing, that's your cue to start marching. So they know, the color sergeants and the colonels know when they're supposed to go. Okay, now Ohio's going, we're supposed to swing in behind them. When they get 50 yards ahead, then the next one's supposed to swing in behind them. That's the plan. Now the 1,000 men in the 53rd don't know that. Only the colonel and George Poundstone know the plan. So you have to be brave because you're up front. You have to be strong because you have to hold that flag high and you're marching across creeks, you're marching across unplowed fields. It's not like a parade ground or a football field. Sometimes you're running carrying this big flag. So you got to be strong, but you got to be cool-headed too because you're under fire and you have to remember when you're stopping and when you're moving. Because if you don't know, the 1,000 men following you don't know. Another hazard of the color guard unit is you stick out like a sore thumb. Because everybody's dressed basically in blue. You know what they say about Civil War uniforms? They weren't uniform at all. But they were all basically blue uniforms. But every once in a while you see this little splash of color in the line from the other side. You know those were the color guard units. And the other side, the Confederates understood the military purpose of the flags to give guidance to the men because they use the same strategy on their side. So right from the beginning, you are their main objective. They know if they could take out 2 or 3 color guard units, that's 2,000 or 3,000 men that are on the field that don't know where they're supposed to go, when they're supposed to move. And that creates chaos on the enemy side. So before they even start, they're the main objective, they're out front, and the worst part of it all, like I said before, they're the only unarmed men on the field. So it's no wonder the mortality rate of color sergeants and flag bearers was so high. It's 4 times higher than the average Civil War soldier. Excuse me. So George Poundstone was named the color sergeant. So that was a great honor. And these, like I said, these flags weren't only there for inspiration. They had a military purpose. So the commanders not only could the soldiers see when they were supposed to move, when they were supposed to stop, but the commanders knew what the plan was. So when they're a half mile behind the line, they would get up on a barn or in a tree or send an aide up there with binoculars. They could see how the battle was working out, and they knew when the flags were supposed to be moving in which direction. So they could tell what was happening. So the flags did have a great military purpose. Like I said, there's two kinds of flags. There's a national flag and a regimental flag. The national flag, we all know what that is. Old Glory, Star Spangled Banner, whatever you want to call it. We all know what it looks like. The regimental flag had a standard design and shape to it. The regimental flag was kind of a bluish purple color. It had an eagle on it with a ribbon that went underneath the eagle, and it had the name of the regiment on there. So you're supposed to have two of those. Probably 90%, 85 to 90% of the regiments used the standard regimental flag. A lot of regiments had a homemade flag that they used for the regimental flag. A couple of examples I can think of right offhand is the Irish Brigade. There were 3 regiments out of New York, made up all of Irishmen. They put those 3 regiments together to make a brigade, mainly because nobody else wanted to be with the Irish. And that's just the way it was then. But they had these very bright green flags. Lime green flags that had a gold harp in the middle and some Gaelic words on it that I don't know what they were. I should have looked that up. But when you were across the field and you saw those green flags, you knew you were going up against the famed Irish Brigade. Another one was the Iron Brigade out of northern Wisconsin. It was called the Iron Brigade because up there they did the foundries and all that up there. They had a bright red flag, and it had the gold trim like this flag did. But it was a very distinct flag. So there was a lot of the homemade flags you could tell were homemade. They were very distinct. The regimental history of the 53rd Illinois doesn't give a lot about the flag. It just says the regimental flag was made by the ladies of Bruce Township and given to the men in Washington Square upon their departure for Camp Douglas. Now, we don't know who the ladies of Bruce Township were. Streator is the only town in Bruce Township, but Streator wasn't here yet. This is 5 years before Colonel Plum, our founder, even came here. 21 years before he was elected our first mayor. So I'm assuming there's 75 to 100 people lived in all of Bruce Township at that time. Now, from what I do know of regimental flags, they were usually made by one of several groups. When they were homemade, they were made by the wives, sisters, and mothers and girlfriends of the men who had enlisted would get together and offer to make the flag, or it was made by like a quilting bee group from one of the churches or something like that. Now the ladies of Bruce Township were not as creative as some of the others when they made the regimental flags. Like I said, they came in all kinds of colors, all kinds of shapes and sizes. But this flag here is the regimental flag of the 53rd that was made here in Bruce Township. A lot of people tell me, oh, that's the national flag. I know a national flag when I see it. But there are telltale signs that this is the regimental flag. The first being that you might not be able to see it from there, but afterwards I encourage everybody to come up and look close at the flag. It says 53rd Regiment Illinois Volunteers right on the flag. Very, very, very seldom did they paint anything on a flag that was still in service. That would have been sacrilege. You just didn't do it. Not for a flag that was still in service. Now you see a lot of them in museums, and you see a lot of pictures of flags with writing all over them in books, but that was usually after the flag was mustered out of service. Flags, just like men, were mustered into service and mustered out of service. So once it was out of service, they painted their history of the regiment practically, what battles they were in, who their commanders were, but very seldom would they have done that while the flag was in service. And this is definitely the condition of the flag when it was captured. It definitely wasn't printed on there afterwards. Another telltale sign is this flag is 6 feet by 6 feet 6 inches. The standard flag was 6 feet by 6 feet. So they added 6 inches to it. I get asked a lot, why were Civil War flags square? Why not the 3 by 5 dimensions of other flags? Well, because if you go with the 3 by 5 ratio, with this being 6 feet, that would have to be 10. And you'd have to be a very tall soldier to hold it up and have it not drag on the ground. So that's why they went with a square flag. Also, with it being square and shorter, the wind opened the flag up a lot easier because there's a lot less weight and a lot shorter. Civil War flags were 6 feet on the mast and 6 feet on the flag. So that's the second clue, is that it's 6 inches too long. Another clue is the wording, 53rd Regimental Illinois Volunteer. Typically, it's 53rd Regiment Volunteer, Illinois. They got the last two things flipped from what you would normally see a description on a flag or in a book. What I think is the most interesting is the flag pattern. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4. You have 5 rows of stars and 2, 4, 6, 7. That'd be 35 stars. And this is a 34-star flag. If you don't look real close at the center, there's only 6 stars. So what they did, and if you Google a 34-star flag, there's an indentation on both sides here. And you can really see it goes and it goes in and it comes back out. It's really definite. What the ladies of Bruce Township did here is they stretched the stars out to keep a square pattern. So that's another indication that this is a homemade regimental flag. Okay, now you know who Poundstone is and you know a little bit about flags and why they were used and why they were important. Let's get back to the 53rd Illinois. They're at Vicksburg. They fought for 13 straight months. They're with Grant. He finally gets to Vicksburg. And they sit there for 6 weeks. It took 6 weeks of bombardment and sharpshooters into the city to starve out the Confederates. On July 4th, 1863, Pemberton was the name of the general in command at Vicksburg. General Pemberton finally surrendered to Grant. Vicksburg finally fell on July 4th, 1863, day after Gettysburg, obviously. So it was a big week for Abe Lincoln and the people in the North. The 53rd didn't get a lot of rest. The next day they went into the city. They were helping with the wounded. They were helping get food and aid to the civilians. The civilians suffered more than anybody at Vicksburg during that 6-week siege. They were helping with that when they were told the day after 4th of July that you're on the march again. General Grant had ordered Sherman to turn around and go back to Jackson, Mississippi. While Grant was sitting there for 6 weeks trying to take Vicksburg, General Joseph Johnston of the Confederate Army went back into Jackson, Mississippi, and he was rebuilding the railroads. He was trying to get the communication lines set up. And of course, Grant knew he was going to be doing that. So as soon as Vicksburg fell, he told Sherman, you know, take your whole army. He gave him a whole bunch of extra regiments to go with him. And you go back and you retake the capital city of Jackson, Mississippi. One of the brigades that got sent and added to Sherman's army that day was Lauman's brigade with the 53rd Illinois. So they marched back to Jackson. They got back to Jackson on about July 8th. Again, Sherman made a couple of charges. He saw how well entrenched Johnston was. Johnson did the same thing that Pemberton did. He was well entrenched, well organized, well fortified. You weren't going to take him. And Sherman learned from Grant. He said, I'm not going to waste any more Union lives. We're just going to surround the city, cut them off all their communications, and bombard them until they give up. We're going to lay in a siege of Jackson. And so that's what they did. The siege started on July 10th. At dawn, the cannon started. They had 150 cannon all day long, 150 cannon bombarding the city of Jackson. By the time it was over, they said there was nothing left but chimneys. They called Jackson Chimneyville after that, because that was all that was left, were chimneys sticking up. They bombarded every house, every building they could hit. But that started on July 10th. On July 11th, same thing. Sun comes up, they start bombarding, they start shooting anything that moves in the city. Civilian, dog, cat, horse, soldier, they didn't care. You see something moving, shoot at it. So, of course, all the citizens are hunkered down in their basements, soldiers are hiding, and Sherman is just bombarding the heck out of the city of Jackson. July 12th starts out like any other normal day. Start bombarding. But something drastically went wrong on July 12th. We don't know what it was, what Laumann was thinking. But at one point, Jacob Laumann ordered 3 companies of men. Now remember, at the beginning of the war, a company was 100 men at full strength. Right? This is a year and a half later. He orders 3 companies of men to get into formation and charge across the field. Now, Johnson has 26,000 men lined up in like a 2.5 mile radius in front of the city. Sherman has 50,000 men, and they're lined up 500 yards away, and they've got like a 2.5, 3 mile radius around them, the line. The area between those 2 battle lines is known as no man's land. Right? So he's getting these 3 companies of men, and the 53rd was on the very far right of the line of Sherman's lines there in front of Jackson. So he tells them, get into formation and charge across the field into that line. Now his other commanders and his lieutenants, like, you're crazy. That's suicide. Why would you send them across there? What good is going to happen if they get all the way across that line? They're not going to tell 26,000 men to drop their arms. They're going to get over there and be all by themselves. We don't know what he was thinking, why he ordered it. But Laumann was determined, and he ordered that charge. Those 3 companies only added up to 243 men. Yeah, 243 men. The color guard unit said, we're going with them, because they lead every charge. So those 10 color guard unit got in front of them, and the colonel and the lieutenant colonel said, those are our men, we're going with them also. So a total of 255 men lined up. They were led by Sergeant George Poundstone, carrying this flag. They lined up, they got into formation, and they started marching across no man's land, 500 yards away from the Confederate line. Now the people on the other side, the Confederates, couldn't believe what they were seeing. All of a sudden, this small band of men is marching across the field toward them, and Poundstone's leading them, holding that flag. They couldn't believe their luck. All of a sudden, there's 3,000 infantry rifles aimed at this small band of men. Not only that, the Washington Light Artillery was a very famous artillery unit of the South, and they were directly across the field with the Orphan Brigade out of Paducah. They had 6 cannon. And those 6 cannon loaded their cannon, and they aimed them at that small band of men. They got about halfway across no man's land, and someone yelled fire, and all hell broke loose. In the first volley, about half of those men went down on the spot. Stopped them right in their tracks. A few of them got some shots off. They reloaded, got a couple shots off. They regrouped, shoulder to shoulder, and they started marching a second time. They went a ways, and the hail of bullets was so strong they got stopped again. This time some of the men got down on their bellies. Some of them got down on their hands and knees to shoot back. They were trying to make themselves as small of a target as they could. But the longer they stood there, they stayed there, the more the enemy was honing in their fire on them, and minute by minute, they were losing more men. They knew they couldn't stay there. They had to keep moving. They got up and they went forward a third time. Regimental history says they got remarkably close to the enemy's fortifications. One newspaper account that I read said they got within 10 yards. I have a hard time believing that. But whoever wrote the regimental history said they got remarkably close. They were very impressed with how far they got. Might have been 20 yards, might have been 50. But they were marching into thousands of men shooting at them. This time when they got stopped, though, they couldn't go any further. Those that could turned and headed back. Some of them ran, some walked, some crawled. But they got back to the enemy line. 255 men and boys from LaSalle County made that charge. 66 came back. Almost every one of them was injured in one way or another when they got back. They said the majority of that 66 died within a few days of their wounds when they got back. But if you do the math, 255 men made the charge, 66 came back. That means there's 189 men laying in no man's land, wounded, dead, or dying. Sergeant George Poundstone was not one that came back. He was laying out there in no man's land. He had a good friend who wrote home to his father, Richard Poundstone, that charge that they made that day was as gallant as it was disastrous. He said he saw George go down twice, saw the flag get up twice. He said the third time he saw the flag go down, it didn't get back up. He didn't know if George was dead, alive, captured. He said, but that's where it was in front of Jackson. When Richard Poundstone got that letter here in Farm Ridge Township, he took his only son Samuel that was still at home working the farm with him and said, we're going to go down and we're going to get George. He hitched up a pony right then and there to a wagon, told his wife, we're bringing George home. If he's alive, we're going to nurse him back to health. If he's dead, we're going to bury him on our family plot, not have him buried in Mississippi. So Richard Poundstone Samuel, without Rand McNally or any kind of device, they found their way to Mississippi to get George. Now, let me jump back to the battle here. While they were, he had got that, but right after the battle, those men were shot down. 189 men are laying in no man's land, 90+ degree heat. The whole eastern half of the country was in the middle of a terrible heat wave at the time. All right, they're in wool uniforms and they're laying out on the field. This charge happened on July 12th at 9:15 a.m. They laid there all day in that heat, on that field, in no man's land, while the bombardment just kept coming. That night, the sun goes down. The men were too far. They were too close to the enemy's line to try to get out there and help them. So they laid all night on that field moaning and crying. The next day, the sun comes up on Monday the 13th. Same thing. Bombardment begins again right at dawn. 150 cannon. Those men laid there again, 90+ degree heat, all day on Monday. Monday night, they said nobody slept on that end of the field because not only the stench that was starting to develop, but because of the moans and the cries of the men of the 53rd laying out on that field. The next day, the 14th, bombardment's going on again. It's been 48 hours, about 10 a.m. A rider's coming across the field with a white flag. General Sherman thinks that they're finally going to give up and give the city of Jackson. But it was the rider just had a note from General Johnston saying, for God's sake, let's show some compassion to those men on the field. These are your men. They're laying out there dying. Let's have a 2-hour ceasefire so I can get a burial detail out there and we can collect the wounded. Now, if you know, Sherman was a very hard-nosed, I'm trying to be politically correct on describing him. He showed no sympathy for anybody. But these were his men. If they were Confederates, he would have said, you know, go suck eggs. You know, but these weren't Confederate. These were his men. These were men who affectionately called him Uncle Billy. And he knew that Laumann ordered a disastrous charge for no reason. He felt some sympathy for these guys. So he wrote on the back of the note and sent it back with him, at noon there will be a 2-hour ceasefire. At 2 p.m. exactly, I'll shoot off a cannon. That's a 2-minute warning for you to get off the field, and the siege of Jackson will begin. So right at noon, sometime between noon and 2 p.m. on Tuesday the 14th is when that George Poundstone was found. He was laying in the field. He had been shot through his left thigh. He was shot through the center of his chest. And the worst wound of all, he was shot through his left eye. It exited above his left ear and blew out about 20-25% of his skull. And he was still alive.
Oh my God.
Laid there for 2 days. You got to wonder, what could he have been thinking? Laying there for 2 days with the cannonading going on, in that heat, in that stench, with those wounds. He knew he was dying. I mean, he'd been in the service 1.5 years at that point. He'd seen men die with much lesser wounds than that. You know, was he thinking of his family in Farm Ridge Township? Was he thinking of the men of the 53rd that he served with? You know, some girl he dated at one time? We have no idea what he was thinking, but we do know that while he was laying there, he tried to save this flag from being taken as a trophy of war by the enemy. Because sometime between the time he was shot and the time he was found, he had torn the flag off the flagstaff and he stuffed it inside his tunic. Now, I kind of think maybe he was trying to stop the wound, stop the bleeding of his chest. But all the newspaper accounts of the day all credit him with he was trying to hide the flag. Because there's only one thing worse than being routed by your enemy, and that's to be routed by your enemy and have them take your flag. So he was trying to protect the flag from being taken. Now, if he had died on that field like he probably should have, they had probably just dug a small trench and kicked him and rolled him into the whole shallow grave, and they'd have never discovered the flag. But he was still alive. So they took him back and took him as a prisoner, and when they were tending to his wounds, they found the flag. This here is the blood stain from his chest wound. There's more stains up in here, but those are George Poundstone's blood stains to this day still on this flag. Now, he was taken back, kept as a prisoner of war. That night on the 14th, overnight, Johnson evacuated the city of Jackson. So the next day at dawn, when Sherman realized Jackson was empty, he sent his troops in. And when they went into Jackson, they found all the wounded and the captured still there. They left the wounded behind. That's when they found Poundstone. They sent him to Vicksburg, to a hospital that was now under Union control. He died 2 days later of his wounds at Vicksburg, and he was buried in Vicksburg. The flag, though, when they had captured the flag, before they evacuated, they passed the flag up and down the Confederate lines. They, of course, were celebrating. I mean, to capture a flag is a big deal in the Civil War. You see these missing parts here on the flag. Each man on that line of the Paducah, Kentucky Orphan Brigade and the Washington Light Artillery was allowed to cut off a 1-inch square as a souvenir. So if you get up here, you can see there's a lot of 1 inches cut off of here. So a lot of Confederates got souvenirs of this flag. When we had the flag restored, I told them I didn't want that. They could have replaced it or put some material behind it. And I said, no, leave it as is. That's part of the history of the flag. So what happened to Jacob Laumann? I get asked that question a lot. Jacob Laumann, immediately after that charge happened, somebody told Sherman about it. He was on the other side of the line. He rode over to that area of the line. He immediately placed Jacob Laumann under arrest, put him in handcuffs. He was so angry at him for telling those men to make that ill-fated charge. Because nothing good was going to come out of it. He knew, and those soldiers knew, that they were either going to be killed, they were going to be wounded, they were going to be captured. There was no other option. And before George Poundstone, all three happened. He was wounded, he was captured, and he died and was killed. So Laumann was placed under arrest. He eventually, after the evacuation of Jackson, Sherman sent him back to Iowa, where he was from. Now he was, except for this episode, he was really a good man. He was a local politician who was very popular in his hometown. He raised a regiment. They made him the colonel of the regiment as a reward, like they did Hitton Cushman when they organized the 53rd. They made him the colonel, and because he was very well liked, and because he made no mistakes, he just moved right up in rank to become a brigadier general who had no military training. And of course that showed on July 12th, 1863. He had no military training. So they sent him back to Iowa to await his court-martial. His court-martial never came. He died 20-some years after the war, never explained himself. No one still knows why he made that charge, why those boys from LaSalle County had to die. What happened to the flag? Well, we know the Washington Light Artillery and the Orphan Brigade got the flag. They cut off the pieces. But we don't know what happened to it after that. It went missing. It was found in June of 1886. That's 23 years after it was captured. It was found in a box in the basement of the War Department by a janitor. He opened it up, and there was a flag, and he unfurls it, and of course they know it's the 53rd flag because of the writing on the flag. So they knew who it belonged to. Now this is 1886 when the flag's discovered. And right after the Civil War, nobody wanted anything to do with the war. They didn't want to talk about it. It was a horrific event that the citizens lived through, the ones that did live through it. But by 1886, the Civil War was all the rage because all the old soldiers started dying off, and all the young soldiers are now starting to get old. And they're starting to write their memoirs and telling their stories of the battles, and they're taking their kids back to Gettysburg and Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg and Jackson to show them the sights that they've been telling them about these battles their whole lives. So there was a resurgence of interest in the Civil War in the 1880s. People started collecting guns, they started collecting uniforms, any kind of bullets or whatever they could find on the battlefields. Because at this point, you know, time heals all wounds, as they say. At this point, there's a lot of interest in the war. And that's right, in 1886 is when the flag is found, and it's a front page story in the New York Times. And the New York Times tells the story of George Poundstone and his gallantry of trying to save this flag from being captured by the enemy. And to use a common phrase, it went viral. All the newspapers across the country picked the story up, and they started replaying the story. They were interviewing people from the 53rd they could get and asking them what their recollections were. And it became a very famous flag and a very famous story in the 1886. They decided what they were going to do with the flag is let's send it back to Illinois. We don't know what to do with it. We know it belongs to the 53rd Illinois. Let's send it back to Illinois. The governor at that time was Governor Oglesby. Oglesby was not going to miss a PR opportunity. The flag comes back, it's like, you know, we really need to build this up. He decides that he's going to rededicate this flag in the memory of the 300,000 men from Illinois that volunteered, and many gave their lives for the preservation of our Union. Now remember, 300,000. Originally, Lincoln asked for Illinois to give up 12,000 men. By the time the war was over, it was 300,000. That's very impressive. Because we were, you know, still a sparsely populated, considered a western state at that time. But he rededicated the flag. This flag stood in the rotunda of the Illinois State Capitol from 1886 to 1922, over half a century. And this flag was dedicated to all the men and women who served from Illinois. So we should be proud of this flag. It was during this time that the state did something, I don't say this often, they did something right. Illinois doesn't do a lot of things. They did something right. After they got this flag, Oglesby decided, you know what? Maybe we should collect all the Civil War flags, all the regimental and national flags that were in service to the Civil War, and make the state the ownership of these flags. So they made a law that if you had a Civil War flag, it belonged to the state of Illinois and you were to turn it in. Very, very unpopular at the time because a lot of these people's grandfathers brought the flags home from the Civil War. Their great-grandfathers by 1922 brought these flags home, and it's been in our house all these years. What do you mean we got to turn it into the state? But the state said because they're historical and we want to preserve them. So by 1922, the state had several dozen of these flags that had been turned in. Excuse me, in 1922, they were building a new hall called Howlett Hall down in Springfield. Howlett Hall had what they called a hall of flags, where all the flags that they had collected up to that point were put on staffs and they were hung in this hallway behind a glass case. And they were there from 1922 to 2003, 81 years. Another 81 years this flag held. And you could see, where it was on the staff, you could see the lines where the folds were when it was hanging down on the staff. By 2003 though, these flags were starting to deteriorate. There was a pile of what looked like dust on the floor beneath these flags, but it wasn't really dust. It was pieces of silk that were falling off the flag. A few of the flags actually got 2 or 3 hours of sunlight on them through a window every day, and they were fading badly. Civil War buffs, local historians were all starting to yell at the state, you got to do something. These are not just cool flags, they're not just relics, these are national treasures, these are historical artifacts, and they need to be treated as such. The state of Illinois, in 2003, did a second thing right. They built a building just for the flags. All the flags, and now by 2003, the state has 1,000 flags in its collection. And they were labeled as they got them, Illinois State Flag, this is Illinois State Flag #1. And the Illinois State Military Museum down in Springfield is located on the old property that was Camp Lincoln, which was a Civil War training camp in the Springfield area. Adjacent to the Illinois State Military Museum is the National Guard Complex, the State National Guard Complex. They share Camp Lincoln's property with the Illinois State Military Museum. So they took one of those buildings. It was just a huge brick framed building with nothing in it. It was just the brick walls, nothing else in these buildings, about the size of an average sized barn. A pretty good sized building, but it was all brick. They built a building inside that building. And it was a very high-tech insert, like building in there. It was humidity controlled, air conditioned, very high-tech building that they started to house the flags in. These flags were put in filing cabinets that the drawers were an inch thick, but they were 7 feet wide and 7 feet deep. So the flags could be laid flat between acid-free paper on all these drawers in there. And if you go in there, it's just rows and rows of filing cabinets, and each drawer is a separate flag. Each drawer can lock, and you could close the door and lock the door on each case. Then the building is locked, and then the outer brick building has big doors that are bolted locked, and that's inside a fenced area that's guarded by Illinois National Guardsmen. So the flags are safe. They are very, very safe. But as they say, out of sight, out of mind. And there they sit. And every one of those flags down there has a story. Might not be as dramatic as this one, but they all have a story. And they all represent 1,000 men who fought and died for that flag. Now, trying to get the year right, because somebody will check. 2012, Memorial Day weekend, Chuck Stanley, a friend of mine who is a writer for the Streator Ottawa Daily Times, whatever you want to call it, was challenged to do a story on Memorial Day weekend about a local boy or man who served in the military and did something heroic. Chuck is quite a history buff. And he remembered a guy from Grand Ridge at one time told him about a great uncle that supposedly was a hero at a battle at Jackson, and he didn't have all the specifics. Well, Chuck dug into it, and he found the story, and he found the resources. And he did a great job telling that story that I just spent an hour telling you. Yeah. That I just spent an hour telling you. He kind of did an abbreviated version, one page of the paper. And I read that. That year I was president of the Streatorland Historical Society. I was also president of the LaSalle County Historical Society. And I read that story. Had everything I liked. It, flags, Civil War, been a Civil War buff my whole life, local history. It's like it all ties into one story. I read it and I reread it. I went to bed that night, I woke up the next morning, I read it again. And it was a sidebar article that caught my attention. An interview with Bill Lear, the head of the guy that runs the Illinois State Military Museum, and he was explaining that there are over 1,000 flags in this collection. And someone, a sponsoring individual or an organization, if they donated or raised about $20,000, you could get one of these flags restored and get it preserved, and you could possibly, if you jump through all the hoops and do all the paperwork, get that flag back to your hometown. He said it's not easy, and he was not discouraging it, but he was in the article. He was saying, you know, if you're going to do this, you better be prepared. Well, I looked at my wife and I said, guess what I'm going to do? So go for it. So I went to the LaSalle County Historical Society. I asked the board, and Jerry was on the board at the time. And I said, I want to do this. I want to bring this flag home. I want to tell the story of the 53rd. Will you back me? Will you support me financially, morally, manpower, whatever? And the board resoundingly said, yes, let's do this. Then I approached the Streatorland Historical Society. I asked that board, same thing. You know, if I jump into this, and they said yes, you know, and they're here today still working for the flag. But they said, yes, we will support you. So a group of friends and I, Jerry was part of that, and his wife, and Ron was a big supporter with the Civil War Roundtable group. And it took about a year and a half, and we did some fundraisers. We did chicken spaghetti dinners, some trivia nights. We sold chances on a flag that Jerry's wife made for us, a replica flag. We did whatever had to be done. And thank God, we have a guy here in town, Bob Deacon, who made a great donation toward us. I'm not saying it wouldn't have been done if Bob didn't make his donation, but he made it a lot easier. So we got it done. It was in November 2012, Veterans Day weekend. I remember we rededicated this flag.
2016.
It was 2016. Thank you. If I make a mistake, I know somebody will correct me. And so that's how the flag got here. And again, I didn't do it. Everybody, you know, always thanks me for the job I did getting the flag, but it was the work of well over 100 individuals. I was the face of the project. I led the project. I'm not shy. I'll get up and talk in front of people I don't know. But we got it done. And here it is. At this point, you know, I still haven't figured out how to end this program. So at this point, does anybody have any questions? Because there was a lot thrown out there.
Dave, and I know this, you told us this before, but why did they not put non-glare glass on this?
Okay. after we dedicated that first day, I got a lot of complaints from people because everybody wanted their picture in front of the flag and all they get is a reflection. I called down and talked to Bill there at the Illinois State Military Museum. They're the ones that actually did the restoration. And he said that was on purpose because non-glare glass, what it does is it lets light come through it and not reflect back. They wanted the most reflective light possible because they want as little light to hit the flag as possible. So that's why it's so reflective. We here at the library, and the library board has been great to work with also. We had to buy special lights, and they look like regular fluorescent lights, but they're a different kind of fluorescent. They give off the same light but less lumens, which means it's not as strong. They've agreed we always have to keep the windows closed in this room. Even though windows are to the north, you're not going to get any direct sunlight, but as little light pollution as possible in here. So, Kathy?
Did you tell them that the music that we were playing at the beginning was from a regimental reenactment band that helped fundraise?
Yeah, and they like to brag they put us over the top. The 33rd Illinois Regiment was a regiment of teachers out of Normal, Illinois. They were mostly from the college, teachers and students. And there is a replica band of the 33rd Illinois. It's made up of local musicians from Central Illinois. They only play 1860s instruments, which are very expensive to find and then very expensive to get updated. And they do concerts, and they play Civil War. The fundraiser that put us over the top, they did a concert for us at Engle Lane Theater. And they like to brag that, we raised like 12, 13,000 before they came along. They helped us raise the last 3, but they like to say they put us over the top. So, and good for them. And that was their music that we were playing.
Have you got any count on how many Illinois regimental flags have been restored like you have done with this one?
Last I heard, and I haven't talked to anybody down there for a couple of years, there are now 7 flags on display in Illinois. I think it's McHenry County did 2 flags. There's one in Joliet. Those 2 are both in their courthouse. There's one at a new history museum in Joliet. There is one at the Illinois State Military Museum. There is one at the old state capitol in Springfield. Number 6 is at the Grand Army of the Republic Museum in Springfield. And this is number 7. Actually, this was 6. Grand Army of the Republic was the 7th one. So it's very rare in Illinois. There's not one in the whole city of Chicago on display. It is a national treasure, and I wish more people in Streator realize what we have here. Gloria?
I have 3 questions. Dan.
Sure.
Did George ever come back home? Did his family get him?
George Poundstone?
Yes.
Okay.
And is he buried?
I'm glad you asked that, because I usually say it, and for some reason I didn't do it this time. Yeah, his dad and his brother went down there. They found George. They dug him up, wrapped him in a blanket, put him in the wagon, and brought him back to Farm Ridge Township. Do you know where, I'm sure everybody here knows where the cemetery is north of Grand Ridge, about 2 miles north. It's on the east side of the road. He's not buried there. He's buried across the street. There is what I always thought was overflow, a few graves across the road. That is the Richard Poundstone family plot. He owned an entire section of land, a mile square of land. His house was a mile over from Route 23, the road that runs parallel north-south. The house was on that road. So Route 23, the far eastern end of his property, was his backyard. So as far back away from the house as possible is where they put the family plot. And just happened to be a cemetery eventually came along across the street from it. But that's where he's buried, is right across from the Grand Ridge Cemetery. And if you're driving north to Ottawa and you look to your left, at that little plot, there's 2 obelisks there. An obelisk is a long, tall thing. The one on the left, which would be the one furthest to the south, is in honor of Sergeant George Poundstone. He's buried right in front of it. That's where his headstone is. The obelisk to the right is in memory of the 53rd Illinois Volunteer Regiment. His brother, who joined the cavalry, the Ford's Cavalry, is buried in front of that one. So I'm glad you asked that. So I drove by that hundreds of times in my life, not knowing.
Did the brother die in the Civil War?
Yes, he died during the Civil War also. Not at the Battle of Siege of Jackson, but sometime during the war.
Okay, I have 2 more.
Okay.
What happened to Cushman? We went back to Iowa. Then-
Lauman?
Lauman.
Loudon?
Yeah.
He went back to Iowa. He died of old age. 20-some years after, he never did. The court-martial never came.
What part of Iowa?
I don't know right off the top of my head.
And
I used to. But it's been a year since I've done a program. But
my third question is, the flag that's on loan to us, is it?
yes, it's on permanent loan. As long as we don't screw it up. No vandalism, no getting caught with the windows open, lights up. They want it here as long as possible. They actually have nowhere to put it down there. So yeah, it's on permanent loan to us. Supposedly every 5 years I have to redo paperwork for it, and I've only done it once, so.
Was it Pomeranke made the frame?
Yes, kudos to John Pomeranke, local carpenter. He made the frame of this. He used old wood. When we did the new addition, we had to take out a couple of windows. So he incorporated that wood in here. He had to buy some new wood to add to it, but those were incorporated in here. Because it just came in the black frame when it came. So he framed it out nicely so it would fit the room better. He also made that frame for the Greener rifles there also. So, yeah. Before I get done, I was told I have to plug these. We have some really cool coffee mugs. When we ordered them for the dedication in 2016, ordered them like a month and a half before the dedication. They came that afternoon while I was here doing the dedication. I went home and they were there. But these we were selling for $15. We're selling them now for $10. Anyone who wants a nice souvenir of the Poundstone flag, that's an actual picture of the flag on the mug. I also have some bookmarks. If anybody would like a bookmark, I think there's enough one for everybody here. It kind of briefly tells the story that I just told, and has a picture of Poundstone and the flag on it too. I also wanted to plug my buddy Jim Woodruff. In 2016, when we did the dedication of the flag, a guy from Mississippi saw the story of the flag on Facebook, and he contacted me. And he told me he wrote a book about the siege of Jackson. He dedicated a whole chapter of this book on this flag and it being captured, the story, kind of the story I just told you. I had a chance to meet him. He took me around the city of Jackson and showed me exactly where Poundstone went down, showed me exactly where the 53rd was lined up and the charge was made and where Lauman was. It was very interesting. So, if there are no more questions, like I said, feel free to take a bookmark if you'd like one. We have cookies and punch or lemonade in the back, and please drink and eat all of it because Mary Lou made it and I don't want it to be wasted. Yes, ma'am.
What made the library its home? Why isn't it anywhere else?
I'm guilty of that. Because I was the one who led the restoration project, the whole thing. I felt all along it needed to be back to Bruce Township. It was made here by the ladies of Bruce Township. It needed to go somewhere in Bruce Township. I started looking around the city. City Hall does not have, a setting that's perfect for this flag. I was looking at the armory, and, you know, that just didn't seem like the right setting. I wanted it somewhere that would be public, people could come see it. The Streatorland Historical Society would have been great, but we don't have a whole wall. And there's a lot of criteria. There has to be at least 2 doors between the flag and the outside. So it has to be not only, so it has to be a room inside. And we wouldn't have had the 2 doors that we could lock. Also, like I said, the size of it. I always thought this was the perfect setting for it.
We had to have a camera.
What's that?
Cameras, security.
Yeah. The LaSalle County Historical Society obviously wanted it for their museum. It fits in with their mission of collecting artifacts that are pertinent to the county history. But again, it just had the 1 door you open up and it's an opened up area. So this was always my first choice. And it didn't take a lot of arm twisting of the board to agree to it. So, yes.
So this flag is what started Illinois collecting Civil War flags in the first place?
Yes.
Because you said it was...
This was the first flag collected. Yeah, it was after it was sent back to Illinois, they decided, hey, this is kind of cool having one of our old flags. We should collect them all. Yeah.
Is Oglesby named after Oglesby, the mayor or governor that you were talking about?
Is it?
That's a good question.
So I know there's an Oglesby and there's an Ogilvy.
No.
So I don't know which is which.
It was at this.
Yeah. But I think you're probably right. I mean, why else would a town be named Oglesby?
One last question. With that flag, I remember you telling me that it's silk, and silk deteriorates faster than what the Confederates
Yes.
flags do.
Yes. Union flags were made out of silk, which is paper thin, and they're deteriorating quickly. The Confederate flags were made out of cotton. Obviously, they had a lot of cotton. And those flags are holding up great. Yeah, those flags are good. And part of the problem with the cotton flags, one of the restorers was telling us one time, is that it still has poison ivy and allergens in it. And a lady working on one of them actually got poison ivy from working with a flag that had been for 100 and some years, and somebody else actually was allergic to a flag because of the pollen that was still in the cotton. So the cotton holds those things much better than the silk. This flag, if you look real close when you get up here, it has a very thin mesh that this flag is sewn onto, or else it wouldn't even hold together. Yes.
So it's sewed on a backing, the flag, the
Yes.
gray part?
Yes, yes, it's sewed on the, if you look real close, and you can see 3/4, or well, it'd be half, those 2 sides there. Each one of these strands here of the fringe is sewn on. So they don't just, you know, and you got a painstaking job doing that. The ones on the bottom are free hanging, which really made it interesting trying to get it here, because it was framed up and it was all covered with cardboard and it had arrows. Keep this side up. And I said, well, what would happen? And he goes, those fringes have to stay down, because if you flip it upside down, it'll be a mess, and it's already hermetically sealed, and we're not going to open it back up. So yeah, that was quite an ordeal.
So did the Bruce Township ladies put the mesh behind it?
No, that happened.
That was the restoration.
That was an earlier restoration. In 1922, when they were putting all the flags into the Howard Hall, a group of ladies from Boston were traveling across the country, and they came and they spent a couple of months sewing this mesh onto all the flags in the Illinois collection at the time, and then they moved on to another state.
So was the fringe the original?
Yeah, the fringe is all original. Yeah, everything's original except for the black meshing you can see when you look real close on it.
So when you got this flag, then it all went through all the paperwork, did you have to have this flag restored again?
No,
No?
no, they restored it, and they, like I said, they put it on here, hermetically sealed it, and they say it's good for 200 to 300 years. As long as, like I said, no vandalism, don't let light hit it, anything like that.
No earthquakes.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for your patience. I know I talked half an hour longer than I was supposed to. Thank you.